Censorship in Britain wasn't just strict, it was ruthless. Films that dared to poke, provoke, or step outside the rules didn't just get a slap on the wrist, they got slammed with outright bans. Imagine buying a ticket only to find the movie so dangerous it was yanked from theaters. Which stories were so shocking that censors locked them away from public view? Stick around, because the reel of forbidden British cinema is about to spin faster than you'd expect. The Devils, 1971. If there's one British film that defines the word banned, it's Ken Russell's The Devils. This wasn't just controversial, it was explosive. Russell, already known for his wild visual style, took a true historical episode about a French priest and his enemies, then cranked it up with visuals that stunned critics and audiences alike. The result? Chaos. British censors hacked away at the movie, but even then it was too much for many countries. In some places, entire reels were cut out before anyone was allowed to see it. The combination of violence and disturbing imagery pushed boundaries that had never been tested before. Even the British Board of Film Classification didn't know what to do, issuing one of its harshest ratings and forcing edits that didn't satisfy anyone. The film's notoriety became part of its legend. Audiences who did manage to see the full version whispered about scenes that were supposedly too shocking to describe. Decades later, when censored material resurfaced, it only confirmed the movie's reputation as one of Britain's most notorious banned creations. Ken Russell didn't just make a film, he made a lightning rod. To this day, The Devils is studied, debated, and remembered not only as a bold piece of cinema, but as a reminder of just how nervous censors were about anything that dared to disturb the comfortable order. And disturb it, Russell absolutely did. A Clockwork Orange, 1971. Stanley Kubrick's Clockwork Orange didn't just flirt with controversy, it dove headfirst into it. Adapted from Anthony Burgess's novel, the film followed a young man who seemed to take delight in chaos. The story was already a powder keg, but Kubrick's chilling direction made it unforgettable. When the film first hit Britain, it immediately sparked outrage. Politicians, parents, and newspapers blasted it as dangerous, claiming it would inspire real-world crime. Soon, reports surfaced of alleged copycat incidents. The backlash was so intense that Kubrick himself asked for the movie to be withdrawn from British theaters. That meant that, in the very country it was made, audiences couldn't see it for decades. Outside Britain, bans spread across the map. Ireland, Spain, and South Africa all kept the movie off screens for years. Censors argued that its mix of stylized violence and dark humor was simply too much for society to handle. Yet, like many banned films, the attempt to bury it only made it more legendary. By the time it resurfaced officially in Britain after Kubrick's death, it had achieved cult status. Audiences didn't just watch it, they analyzed, debated, and obsessed over every frame. Kubrick may have paid a price for the scandal, but his film became one of the most talked about works in British cinema history, banned, pulled, and silenced for years. A Clockwork Orange still stands as a case study in how a movie can terrify authorities just as much as it fascinates audiences. Peeping Tom, 1960. When Peeping Tom hit British theaters in 1960, it wasn't just banned, it was annihilated. Director Michael Powell, once celebrated for his brilliant films with Emmerich Pressburger, suddenly found himself treated like a cinematic criminal. Why? Because he dared to show a killer who filmed his victims, turning the audience into unwilling voyeurs. The film didn't just disturb critics, it enraged them. Newspapers called it filth and evil. Major cinema chains refused to screen it. Effectively, it was banned through disgust and pulled from theaters after only a few days. Powell's career never fully recovered. He went from being one of Britain's most respected directors to a man shunned by the very industry he helped build. What makes this story even more shocking is how history later flipped the verdict. By the 1970s, critics who had once trashed the film now hailed it as a masterpiece, even comparing it to Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, which premiered the same year and became a classic. Powell's daring exploration of obsession, fear, and the dark side of filmmaking was simply ahead of its time. But in 1960 Britain, that was unacceptable. Peeping Tom was labeled as too sick, too disturbing, too un-British to be shown. The ban and backlash buried it for years. Today it's recognized as one of the greatest British thrillers ever made. But back then, it wasn't seen as art. It was treated like a crime. That's how harshly the film world punished Powell for daring to reveal what lay behind the camera lens. Women in Love, 1969. Ken Russell appears again, and that's no accident. The man had a talent for provoking censors like few directors in history. His film, Women in Love, adapted from D.H. Lawrence's novel, was meant to be a sweeping drama about relationships, freedom, and desire. What Britain got instead was a full-on scandal. The reason was simple. Russell showed more than audiences were used to seeing. For a country still bound by strict limits, this was like a cultural earthquake. Some countries immediately banned it, declaring it indecent. Even in Britain, where it eventually passed censors, it caused endless hand-wringing, arguments, and threats of tighter rules on filmmakers. Yet the film was not just controversy. It won awards, earned critical respect, and featured a performance by Glenda Jackson that made her an international star. The mix of prestige and outrage created a strange, dual legacy. On one hand, Women in Love was celebrated as a daring work of British cinema. On the other, it was scorned as a film that broke the boundaries of decency. Russell thrived on that kind of contradiction. He didn't just make movies, he set fires. And Women in Love proved that he was willing to risk being banned if it meant pushing British cinema out of its comfort zone. Looking back, it's easy to see how tame the film might seem by modern standards. But in 1969, it was like a bomb going off in the polite living rooms of Britain. And that shockwave helped cement Russell's reputation as the country's great cinematic troublemaker. If 1968. Few films captured Britain's rebellious spirit of the late 1960s, quite like Lindsay Anderson's If... This wasn't just a movie, it was a revolution on screen. Set in a strict British boarding school, it followed students who slowly build towards rebellion. But when the story climaxed in a shocking schoolyard attack, censors lost their minds. Several countries instantly banned it, claiming it encouraged violence against authority. Even in Britain, its release was delayed, while nervous officials debated whether it was safe for the public to watch. At a time when student protests were erupting around the world, the movie felt less like fiction and more like a call to arms. The irony? The film's banned status only made it more powerful. Young audiences who managed to see it embraced it as a bold challenge to the old order. It won the Palme d'Or at the Cannes Film Festival, proving that, while Britain's censors were terrified, the rest of the world saw its brilliance. What makes If fascinating is how perfectly it captured its moment. Britain in the late 60s was torn between tradition and rebellion, and Anderson's movie poured gasoline on the fire. By banning it in some places, authorities only confirmed what the film was saying, that the system feared change more than anything else. In the end, If wasn't just a movie banned for its imagery. It became a symbol, cinema's bold rebellion against authority that still carries an edge decades later. Scum, 1979. When Alan Clark's Scum first appeared, it didn't just get banned, it got buried. Originally made for the BBC, the film was meant as a TV drama exposing the brutality inside Britain's Borstal system, the notorious youth detention centers. But when executives saw the finished cut, they panicked. Too raw, too violent, too real. The BBC flat out refused to broadcast it, essentially banning it from television. Clark wasn't one to take defeat lightly. He reshot the film as a feature, and that's when the trouble really began. In cinemas, audiences were hit with unrelenting depictions of life behind bars, bullying, brutality, and corruption. This wasn't polished drama, it was a gut punch, and it shocked the establishment. Politicians and newspapers demanded it be pulled. Some theaters refused to screen it altogether, while censors forced cuts that gutted entire sequences. The controversy only fueled the film's legend. It became infamous as the movie too real for TV, and those words made audiences desperate to see it. Young people in particular recognized its raw honesty in a way critics couldn't dismiss. Ray Winstone's breakout performance gave it even more bite, adding to the sense that this wasn't acting, but testimony. Looking back, Scum holds its place as one of the most uncompromising British films ever made. The ban didn't kill it, it turned it into an underground sensation. And when it finally resurfaced years later, uncut, It proved what Clarke had been saying all along, that sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones the authorities try hardest to silence. Victim, 1961. In 1961, a quiet little British thriller called Victim detonated like a bomb. Starring Dirk Bogarde, it told the story of a lawyer fighting against a blackmail ring that preyed on men with secrets society refused to accept. At the time, Britain still had laws on the books that criminalized certain personal lives, making the film's subject matter groundbreaking and, to many, deeply dangerous. Censors balked. Some countries flatly banned it, including across parts of the United States and in Commonwealth nations. British censors allowed it, but only after nervous debate, labeling it with one of the harshest ratings of the day. The fear was clear. This wasn't just a story. It was a challenge to authority and morality. Critics were split. Some praised it as daring and humane, while others accused it of pushing an agenda. But what gave Victim its true power was Dirk Bogarde himself. At the height of his career, he risked everything to star in the film. His performance was fearless, nuanced, and unmistakably personal. The bans didn't stop the film's message. If anything, they amplified it. Audiences who did see it walked away shaken, recognizing the injustice it highlighted. Over time, Victim has been credited with helping shift public opinion in Britain, making it not just a banned film, but a turning point in cultural history. Back in 1961, though, it was labeled dangerous, proof that sometimes the most threatening thing a film can do is tell the truth. Life of Brian, 1979. The Pythons were masters of making trouble, but with Life of Brian, they ignited one of the biggest censorship storms in British history. The comedy troupe told the story of a man who is mistaken for a great leader, leading to chaos and absurd devotion. The satire was aimed squarely at human folly, but many didn't see it that way. Protests erupted before the film even opened. Several towns across Britain passed local bans, refusing to allow cinemas to show it. Ireland and Norway outlawed it entirely, claiming it was dangerous mockery. The irony? Norway's ban led to one of the funniest ad campaigns ever. Posters in Sweden proudly declared, "So funny, it was banned in Norway." The bans only added fuel to the fire. Crowds lined up to see what all the fuss was about, and the movie quickly became a hit. Monty Python knew exactly what they were doing, poking fun at unquestioned devotion and blind loyalty, but the uproar ensured that critics missed the point entirely. Even with all the outrage, Life of Brian turned into a box office triumph and one of the most quoted comedies of all time. The very fact that it was banned made audiences want to see it even more. The lesson? If you tell people they can't laugh at something, they'll laugh twice as loud. And Monty Python proved it with style. The War Game, 1965. Peter Watkins's The War Game is perhaps the most haunting banned film Britain ever produced. Commissioned by the BBC as a docudrama, it set out to show what a nuclear attack on Britain might actually look like. What viewers got was chillingly real. Firestorms, radiation poisoning, panicked civilians, and the collapse of order. When the BBC saw the finished product, they froze. Officials declared it too horrifying for the public and refused to broadcast it. In effect, it was banned from television for 20 years. Only limited screenings at festivals and private events kept it alive. The government, still anxious about Cold War tensions, backed the ban, worried the film would cause panic. Critics who did see it were stunned. The realism was overwhelming. Watkins used documentary-style techniques, combining handheld cameras and interviews to make the fictional destruction feel terrifyingly authentic. Audiences who managed to attend rare screenings described it as one of the most disturbing films they had ever seen. Ironically, The War Game went on to win the Academy Award for Best Documentary, even though the BBC insisted it wasn't fit for broadcast. The contradiction only added to the film's mystique. When it finally aired in Britain in 1985, audiences understood why it had been hidden for so long. It wasn't just a film. It was a nightmare dressed as news, and for 2 decades it remained one of the most infamous examples of censorship in British broadcasting history. Leather Boys, 1964. On the surface, Leather Boys looked like just another British youth drama of the 1960s. Motorbikes, leather jackets, rockers roaring down the road. But beneath the noise of engines and the cool swagger, it hid something that scared censors stiff. The film dared to portray a friendship between two young bikers with undertones that society at the time wasn't ready to face. In Britain, the film managed to slip past with a restrictive rating, but in several countries it was outright banned. Authorities claimed it was corrupting, using the leather-clad biker culture as an excuse to silence what they really feared, a story that touched a cultural taboo. In South Africa, Australia, and parts of the United States, audiences were flatly denied the chance to see it. What's wild is how ordinary the film looks by today's standards. It's not sensational, not provocative in the loud way. Instead, it's quiet and human, and that was exactly the problem. By showing motorbike rebels not just as violent punks, but as complex people with emotions, Leather Boys broke the mold. The ban, of course, only gave it underground credibility. Within Britain's growing counterculture, the film became whispered about and passed around like a secret badge of rebellion. While the mainstream ignored it, young audiences embraced its honesty. Today it's remembered as one of the first British films to treat its subculture seriously, not as a freak show. But back in 1964, it was dangerous enough to be silenced. Proof that sometimes it's not the loud movies that scare authorities most, it's the quiet ones. The Lovers, 1973. Here's a film that proved even comedies could make censors break into a sweat. The Lovers, directed by Herbert Wise, was spun out of the popular TV series of the same name, following working-class lovers Jeffrey and Beryl as they stumble through the highs and lows of young adulthood. Sounds harmless, right? Not to the guardians of morality in the early 70s. The dialogue was frank, the humor cheeky, and the attitude irreverent. For censors in South Africa, that was enough to slap it with a ban. The idea that ordinary young people might talk openly about their lives in a way that didn't conform to conservative ideals was too much for officials already paranoid about cultural change. In Britain, it barely scraped past with a rating that kept younger audiences out. But abroad, it disappeared from screens entirely. The backlash was ironic, considering the film's roots. It wasn't an exploitation flick or an underground experiment. It was based on a hit TV comedy loved by mainstream audiences. But the jump from living room sitcom to big screen feature gave Wise and the writers room to push boundaries. And push they did, straight into territory that made overseas censors choke. The ban didn't kill the film's reputation. It supercharged it. Among young people in Britain, it became a rallying cry for honesty and cheeky realism. Critics praised its daring tone, while some older voices called it a bad influence. In the end, The Lovers wasn't silenced, it was immortalized. Proof that even comedy can be powerful enough to frighten those who would rather keep laughter under lock and key. The Wild and the Willing, 1962. In 1962, The Wild and the Willing charged onto screens with the energy of a new era and almost immediately ran into censorship trouble. A drama about restless university students rebelling against the stiffness of British tradition, it was blunt in its portrayal of youthful independence. That was enough to make foreign censors panic. Several countries outside Britain quickly banned the film. They argued it was too daring in its treatment of young people's personal lives and relationships. Australia, South Africa, and parts of Asia refused to let it screen, claiming it undermined traditional values. In truth, what terrified them was the idea of young people being shown thinking and acting for themselves. The film also carried another twist. It marked the first big screen appearance of Ian McShane, who would later become a celebrated actor. But at the time, the focus was less on talent and more on the so-called scandal of the story. Critics in conservative outlets blasted it as reckless, while younger reviewers praised it for finally putting a mirror up to a changing Britain. Though banned in some regions, it helped carve out a space for British youth films that followed. Its themes echoed the growing shift of the 1960s, where the voices of the younger generation were no longer willing to stay silent. Today, The Wild and the Willing is seen as a milestone for its cultural snapshot of the early 60s. Back then, it was branded too bold for polite society. A ban that only confirmed exactly what the film was trying to say. Baby Love, 1968. If there was ever a British film that perfectly captured the forbidden fruit effect of a ban, it was Baby Love. Released in 1968, It told the story of a troubled teenager taken in by a middle-class family, only to upend their lives with her unpredictable behavior. From the start, the subject matter made censors nervous. In Britain, it scraped by with cuts, but in several regions abroad, it was simply banned. South Africa, New Zealand, and others declared it too scandalous for public viewing. The irony? By banning it, they gave it a reputation as one of the most daring British films of its era. The film caused headlines partly because of its star. Linda Hayden was just 15 when cast, adding to the firestorm of criticism. Newspapers accused the filmmakers of exploiting shock value, while audiences whispered about the story's forbidden themes. Yet the film wasn't just scandal, it was success. Despite bans abroad, Baby Love made serious money in Britain, riding on the wave of publicity. And Alistair Reed, the director, built a career out of its notoriety, later moving into respected television work. Looking back, the bans say more about the times than the film itself. What was considered too provocative in 1968 now looks tame by comparison. But the story of its censorship remains legendary. Baby Love was proof that if you want to make something unforgettable, get it banned. Memoirs of a Survivor, 1981. By the early 1980s, you might think British films had moved past bans. Not so. Memoirs of a Survivor, directed by David Gladwell and based on Doris Lessing's novel, still found itself blocked in certain regions. The story followed a woman living in a crumbling, dystopian Britain where society has collapsed. Mixing dreamlike sequences with harsh images of decline, it struck a chord with audiences who saw it as eerily close to real life. In South Africa and parts of Asia, authorities reacted by banning it outright. Why? They feared it mirrored their own political unrest too closely. Unlike some of the other banned films, Memoirs of a Survivor wasn't loud, shocking, or violent. It was quiet, poetic, and unsettling. That subtlety made it even more dangerous to censors. A film that whispers about collapse can be more frightening to governments than one that screams. Critics were divided. Some admired its ambition, others called it confusing. But no one denied its atmosphere. With Julie Christie giving a haunting performance at its core, the bans only elevated its reputation, turning it from a niche release into a symbol of how fragile freedom of expression could still be. Decades later, it remains a fascinating relic of British cinema at the edge of censorship, proof that even in the 1980s, the ban hammer was never far away. So, there you have it, 15 British films that rattled cages so hard they got locked away, cut to pieces, or flat out banned. From wild Ken Russell spectacles to quiet dramas that whispered too much truth, these movies prove one thing: censorship never kills curiosity, it fuels it. Which of these banned classics shocks you most? Drop your thoughts below, subscribe for more forbidden film history, and remember, sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones they tried hardest to silence.